All right, now get ready for this one. Yesterday, the congressional chairs of the Progressive, Black, Hispanic, and Asian Pacific American caucuses called on White House senior advisor Stephen Miller to resign after newly uncovered emails show he pushed the website Breitbart to cover white nationalist content between 2015 and 2016. In emails leaked to Hate Watch, a branch of the Southern Poverty Law Center, a report showed more than 80% of the 900 emails obtained related to race or immigration. Hate Watch characterized Miller as being obsessed with white genocide. Miller sent those emails prior to working in the Trump administration and now plays a direct role in forming its immigration policy. The emails were sent to former Breitbart employee Katie McHugh, who was fired from the publication for posting anti-Muslim tweets in 2017. In the emails, Miller suggested she look into white nationalist websites, including, is it VDare and the conspiracy website InfoWars? And that Breitbart draw from the white supremacist journal American Renaissance, or AMREN, which emphasizes crimes committed by immigrants and non-white people. That she write about the French novel, The Camp of Saints, which, according to the SPLC, is popular among white nationalists and neo-Nazis. And he also shared that he was upset Amazon removed Confederate flag merchandise from its site in the wake of the 2015 Charleston shooting. The White House denounced the report, calling the SPLCA a far-left smear organization. And yesterday, White House spokesperson Hogan Gidley told the New York Times, quote, "It concerns me as to why so many on the left consistently attack Jewish members of this administration."
So, David Ignatius, it's not a report. I mean, these are emails, and emails that were confirmed by the former. Conversations were made, confirmed by the former Breitbart employee that Stephen Miller called and was pushing these white nationalist articles and trying to get them to put together white nationalist articles for Breitbart.
So this is a kind of portrait of Stephen Miller in his what he thought were his private moments and private correspondence, but they confirm what we've seen from Stephen Miller. He and in his role as the president's advisor, the president, are pushing buttons in American life that are just so dangerous, so divisive. They've done that from the moment that Trump began his campaign. The rage against immigrants is central to who Donald Trump has presented himself as. Miller is a particularly, I think, mean-spirited example. And the fact that he has this president's ear to the extent that he does is scary. It's good for this stuff to come out again so people can see it and think about it. But in the end, this is about America. People have to look at this material and decide what they think. Are they comfortable with this?
Is this who we are?
Is this who we are?
And Peter Baker, by the way, this is not a report. These are emails. These are Stephen Miller's emails. These are Stephen Miller's words. These are Stephen Miller's thoughts. This is Stephen Miller's obsession with white nationalism,
900 emails?
With white genocide.
900?
This is Stephen Miller constantly pushing to have pro-white nationalist articles written on Breitbart. This is the same Stephen Miller who responded to the Paris killings by talking about a Muslim registry in America. This is the same Stephen Miller who responded to San Bernardino, the shootings there, by talking about the Muslim ban. And Donald Trump followed him every step of the way. You look at these emails, and I don't know how anyone looks at these emails and not conclude that Stephen Miller is a white nationalist or a champion of white nationalism. I mean, I ask anybody on the right, well, not on the right, you're not on the right, you're a Trump supporter. I ask any Trump supporters who support record-breaking deficits, record-breaking debt, tariff taxes, socialist farming schemes, all in the name of a personality cult. I ask you to sift through the 900 emails. and come to a conclusion that he's not a white nationalist, or at least not a champion of white nationalism. Peter Baker, so where do we go from here in the saga of a white nationalist, or at least a champion of white nationalism, inside the White House? Does he stay inside the White House, since he has been revealed by his own words as a white nationalist or a champion of white nationalism?
Yeah, one of the things that's been remarkable about Stephen Miller's White House career is how long it has lasted. In fact, he has been a real survivor in the reality show that surrounds the president, which one after the other, cabinet secretaries and senior advisors and White House chiefs of staff kind of fall by the wayside. Stephen Miller has been the one constant throughout. And he's done it in part by, making himself indispensable to the president at key moments on issues that the president has cared about. He cares about immigration. He shares Stephen Miller's views on these things. He's also made himself closer to Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump, who are, of course, important players in the White House. And I don't know that you're going to see him, necessarily pushed out as a result of this. That he's got a lot of, credit in the bank in that White House, and the president's likely to look at this as just an unfair smear campaign against him, even though, as you point out, these are his own words, not somebody else's interpretation of them. The president tends to get his back up on things like this, and he doesn't, respond to the surround sound in which Democrats and certainly even some Republicans find this kind of stuff very troubling.
Eddie, there's so much to despise in this collection of emails. Yeah. There's one where Stephen Miller writes, in the wake of the shooting in Charleston, where 9 African-American people were murdered at Bible study, he was concerned that stores were taking Confederate flags out. That was his concern in the wake of that shooting. You can read them for yourselves. In some ways, this isn't surprising, though, right? Because we know that Stephen Miller has been the architect of all these policies we've seen. Bans on religious groups coming into this country, separation of families, all the things we're seeing at the border. He and Steve Bannon, we know, saw Donald Trump as a vessel, somebody who could get them and their views into the White House and make significant decisions for this country about immigration. So it's shocking to read some of these emails. It really is. But in some ways not surprising, because he's shown us this is who he is.
And remember, Bannon was running around Europe telling folks on the right and who were on the far right, stand proud when they call you these things, right? First, a couple of things, real quickly. One, complete silence, crickets by Republicans. What have they said? They've said nothing, right? Whether they're champions of white nationalism or white nationalists, what we do know, silence means complicity. So they're complicit with this stuff. That's the first thing. The second thing, we knew who Steve Miller was. We were saying it early on. I remember calling him a white nationalist on Meet the Press, and Mick Mulvaney grabbed his pearls. Oh, my God, right? Mm-hmm. And so we were calling him what he was, and that folks didn't really concede the truth of the claim, and even though the facts were clear. And so then the third thing that I wanted to mention is that even though we were calling him a white nationalist, and even though some people were saying that there was a racist undertow to immigration policy, it was very difficult for folk to see the relationship between the bad faith of folk like Steve Miller and the claims around immigration, right? So it becomes very difficult to disentangle someone who might be, honestly committed to a certain set of immigration policies and someone who's deeply and profoundly racist. That's the third thing. The last thing is this: the insult, the absolute horrible nature of the statement from the White House that folks are coming after him because he's Jewish. To invoke anti-Semitism as a way to defend racism is absolutely unacceptable. And I think we need to call it out for what it is.
It's all new level. But, of course, he said the power of the president is not to be questioned very early on. Stephen Miller did. So.
How do you work alongside Stephen Miller in the Trump White House?
It's a good question.
How do you do it?
I don't know.
And by the way,
you are saying, I'm okay with this.
Exactly.
I am okay with working alongside this person who is in a very senior position. Mm-hmm. I don't want to hear the whole argument, but we're the stopgate. We're saving the world by being there. You really should think about it if you're in that White House.
You can't work next to a guy who's a white nationalist or who champions white nationalist ideology. David, you talk about the Republican Party, how low they have sunk. Mm-hmm. Remember? Back in 2001, I think it was, Trent Lott made an offhanded comment about Strom Thurmond, that the country would have been better off if he had been elected in 1948. And Trent Lott, for that comment, an offensive comment, but for that comment, even after he apologized repeatedly, the Republicans ran Trent out of town. He was the majority leader. And for that one comment, which he apologized for profusely, he was run out of town. Now, you have a guy that has written all of these emails. It's come out. And he's promoting white nationalism. He's pressuring a news website to run white nationalist articles, pressuring them, doing their work for them to champion white nationalism. And as Eddie said, we haven't heard from one Republican.
Eddie used a great word, which was complicity. Yeah. There's a way in which the guardrails, we often say this, the guardrails have come off in American life. And I think part of what's ahead, what I hope is ahead in this next election cycle, is an attempt to rebuild them for people of good faith. And I still think Americans generally are people of good faith to say, no, that's just not acceptable. To look at Stephen Miller's behavior. As you often say, Joe, it's Republicans have to stand up for their values, for the future of their party. This guy's just going to take them over a cliff. And if they don't say something about Stephen, well, right. I
think
but every day we fall a little further.
Yeah.
But that's what I hope is ahead, is attempt to rebuild those guardrails. Say Stephen Miller's, what he wrote is wrong, and we're going to speak out about it. What your point about Trent Lott? No, that was wrong, and we're going to challenge it. We're not the party that's going to live with that. And I just hope that's ahead.
The thing is, what David says, take them over the cliff. You just look at this again. Even if the Republicans are completely devoid of morals, completely devoid of us, even if they're completely soulless, just for argument's sake.
Okay.
They're not. I know a lot of them. I like a lot of them. A lot of them are my good friends. But even if they are completely soulless, even if they were like Bart Simpson and he sold his soul to Milhouse, cynically, look at the demographic changes that are happening. Texas is not going to go Democratic likely in 2020, but I'll bet a lot of money that it's going to go Democratic in 2028. And I'll give better than even odds that it goes Democratic in 2024. Donald Trump is setting these Republicans up to be the Whigs of the 21st century. That right as this demographic change is coming that will fundamentally alter American politics forever, they are doubling down on segregationist policies. And again, even if you were soulless, it makes no political sense. You are setting yourself up for a historic collapse. And yet they just keep doing it, Willie.
As you say that, I'm thinking back to the Reince Priebus post-mortem. Remember
Oh,
that a
my
few years
Lord.
back? This is pre-Trump.
Gosh.
Where they said, boy, we've got to make some changes to our party. We've got to reach out because of these demographic changes, or else we are going to become the Whigs.
And
And
Wow.
look how far it's turned since then. And I would point out that Stephen Miller, read these emails, and remember, this isn't some guy with a radio show somewhere. He's got the ear of the president. He might, I mean, Peter can tell us better, but he's, if not one of the most trusted advisors.
The most
is he the
powerful
most,
guy in there. I think he's the
most
most
powerful
powerful
guy in the
guy
White House,
with
fair
the
to say?
president's ears.
The guy who wrote those emails, the guy who believes those things, the guy who has instructed all these policies along the border, has the ear of the most powerful man in the world in Donald Trump.
And Peter, we always accuse parties of fighting the last war, like generals fight the last war. They always fight the next election. And just history shows, you don't have to be really insightful to know that Donald Trump's 2016 election was a lark. Even Trump said, you could have held it on 10 days. I would have only won one of those 10 times. It is everything lined up perfectly for me on that one day. Donald Trump's coalition in 2016 isn't the future. Barack Obama's coalition in 2008, the coalition of the ascendant, that is the future of American politics, and that is who Republicans are separating themselves from radically every day. And this Stephen Miller story is a perfect example of that, isn't it?
Well, what you hear Republican leaders talk about all the time, of course, is the demographics are not on their side, that the trend and changes in American life are working against them unless they change their approach to reaching out beyond the traditional base. The base that elected Donald Trump is not going to be enough to sustain them over the long term. Just look at the state of Texas. That's been sort of the white whale for Democrats for a long time, thinking someday they're going to turn it blue. It's not, it didn't happen last time. It may or may not happen this time. But at some point down the road, as these numbers do move in Texas, it could turn into a Democratic state the way, say, Virginia did, a state that once was very, very solidly Republican. If that happens, where is your electoral college coalition that gets you back to the White House? It's almost impossible to imagine without Texas a Republican winning the White House. And that's the kind of thing that Republican leaders who are looking beyond the next election are worried about. But they have Donald Trump right now telling him the opposite, in effect, telling him, look, my approach worked. Don't mess with success. I'm going to win again in 2020, and basically he's setting the tone right now for the Republican Party in a way that makes many of them very uncomfortable.
All right, Peter Baker, thank you so much. And still ahead, a live look inside Capitol Hill, where the impeachment hearing into President Trump kicks off not long from now. And we'll speak with a member of the House Intel Committee, Congresswoman Val Demings, next on Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.